All right, so I'm going to introduce our three speakers. So I'll start with Hala Marshood, who's a Palestinian political activist born and raised in Haifa, occupied northern Palestine. She's a PhD student at the University of Manchester, where she's currently calling in from. She recently returned to Manchester from Haifa. We also have Loubna Qutami, who's a co-founder of the Palestinian Feminist Collective and an alumna of the Palestinian Youth Movement. She's also an assistant professor in Asian American Studies at UCLA and currently a postdoctoral research associate in Palestinian Studies at Brown University. Coming to us from Rhode Island. Where are you, Loubna? Somewhere on the East Coast.
I'm in Rhode Island right now.
Rhode Island. And then we have Naomi Barasa, who I think many of you know, who is a feminist, human rights, gender, strategic campaigning, and community organizing consultant. Naomi served in Amnesty International as campaigns director for over 2 decades. She's a community organizer of close to 4 decades who's worked with marginalized communities in urban slums, with Indigenous people, with women and homeless children. Naomi's work has won her local and global recognition with various international and national human rights awards, and she is chair of the Kenya Palestine Solidarity Movement. So we'll start first with Hala, who just left Palestine, for an update on the situation on the ground. I know a lot of us are watching Gaza really, really closely, and it is the heart of the tragedy right now, and usually is, but there's a lot going on in the West Bank and in 48 Palestine, which is now called Israel. So I'd like Hala to just give us a little bit of an update about the situation on the ground before we start.
Yes, thank you, Lena, and hi again, everyone. I'm going to start with the West Bank and say that we can definitely say that the West Bank is also going through what might be considered also one of the brutalist and continued attacks, while it doesn't compare to what's happening in Gaza in terms of scale, but it's also going through terror from both the Israeli army and the Israeli settlers that are basically taking advantage of the war on Gaza to release even more heightened forms of terror on people. Just an example, a very recent one, just last night, they raided Tul Karem and 9 people were shot dead. Now, this is not an isolated event. So for attacks and raids on refugee camps and cities across the West Bank have been happening throughout the past 3 months, and they've actually have become a routine, you might say. Just a few figures, more than 360 people have been killed in the West Bank since October 7th, and more than 5,800 arrested. So the number of Palestinian prisoners almost doubled in Israeli jails in the past 3 months. And one point that is particularly relevant to our event today is the reports on sexual abuse and threats of rapes and so on that the people that are released from Israeli detention are describing. But of course, this gets way less or none global media attention whatsoever. Now, while this has been happening in an intense way in these 3 months, it is important to remember that this situation has been going on in the West Bank for almost 2 years, I can say. And that is because also we are seeing Palestinian resistance happening in the West Bank. Now, I always like to remind myself and others of our strength as well as Palestinians, that we are having resistance in these kinds of places. But again, for 2 years, raids on Palestinian refugee camps have been happening. I don't know if you've heard what happened almost on a daily basis in Jenin or Nablus, for example. But again, these kinds of things did not get media attention in the world whatsoever. This is very, very briefly on the West Bank. Regarding 48, now, to be honest, it does feel a bit awkward to talk about what we're seeing in 48, which compared to the other Palestinian geographies is nothing. It is true that we are seeing heightened forms of repression, and more Israeli so-called civilians are getting armed. But again, it is a bit awkward to talk about this while Gaza is being annihilated and the West Bank is facing daily attacks. And this is also an opportunity for me to acknowledge my privilege in all of this, being a Palestinian that is not facing a genocide at the moment and is not facing daily attacks, and actually having the privilege to be here and talking to you. And this is also a reminder for myself and my people that it is our responsibility as Palestinians everywhere to step up, same as we demand from the world. I'm going to keep it at that, and maybe if you have more questions in the Q&A, I'd be happy to address.
Thank you, Hala. So we'll start by asking, I'll start with Loubna, and then Hala and Naomi, you all should obviously answer as well. What does colonial feminism mean? That's the title of the event today, is Resisting Colonial Feminism. And how is that different from third world feminism? How is that different from the feminism that we want to be practicing as Palestinians, as Kenyans, as people from the global South?
Alina, I missed the first part. Is this question directed to me or?
Yeah, sorry. I asked
Okay.
if you can start, and then we'll ask Naomi and Hala to add to that.
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you for having me. I'm really honored to be here today. Wish the circumstances were different, but I'm happy to be engaging in this conversation, specifically with the community who is there in person and those who are joining virtually. The Palestinian Feminist Collective, we're coming off the heels of a really inspiring weekend where we held an action in New York City called Shut Down Colonial Feminisms. So I think, the last 3 months, but especially this weekend, has really what colonial feminism has really been sitting with us. I think, in short, it is the way in which the forces of empire, whether that's government, media, institutions of higher learning, popular culture, or other institutions or actors, weaponize the language of women's rights in order to justify and enable occupation, invasion, siege, genocide, and other forms of structural violence. And so when we think of colonial feminism, we've definitely been having to grapple with it at its highest form in the Palestinian context in the last 100 plus days. But it is something that has always been something that colonized people of the world have had to contend with, even when it wasn't officially called feminism in previous stages of colonization. So in other words, it is the way in which colonists bring the language of a civilizational mission to the colonies, right? We are coming to teach the quote unquote savages or barbarians how to be civilized, how to be enlightened, practice equality or democracy. We saw some of the most egregious forms of colonial feminism play out in the US invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan, where, the majority of the world population knew that these were wars based on empire, launched by empire, based on resource extraction, based on maintaining hegemonic control for Western powers in the region. But the West promoted these wars as civilizational wars, as bringing democracy to Iraq, as liberating women. And so I think the tension becomes colonized women, colonized people don't see anything feminist about war, don't see anything feminist about dropping bombs and killing children, or see anything feminist about the environmental and health ramifications that results from war. And we could talk more about how colonial feminisms, and specifically Zionist colonial feminisms, has manifested in the last 100 days, which has really pushed groups like the PIA, as well as many others, to actually have a direct interaction about colonial feminism, not just the history of how it harmed our movement and our communities, but how it is actively enabling this genocide in the present.
Thanks, Loubna. Yes, and I'll ask you specific questions about, obviously, the way feminism has been weaponized since October 7th. I think it's we heard even at the ICJ hearings and Israel's opening statement, they talked about the Palestinian quote unquote rapists. So we'll get more into that, but I appreciate that overview, and I'm going to let Naomi add to that if there's anything that you want to add, especially from the Kenyan context.
So thank you so much, Loubna, for everything that you've said. I totally agree with everything. And just before I go to the Kenyan context, I would like to say that to add on what she said, the censoring of the information on the situation in Palestine, and which ultimately undermines the power, the resilience, the agency of the Palestinian people, for me, is part of the whole colonial feminism, because it portrays the Palestinian people, the women, the children, as very powerless, as victims, but also as agents of a backward civilization. So it elevates an attitude that does not humanize Palestinians. It defines gender and feminism within a very colonial confines, very Western. And so it kind of describes and prescribes what feminism, constructive feminism, liberated feminism, and civilized feminism should be. It takes away the power of resistance by Palestinian women. It takes away the power of self-preservation, their culture and everything away, which for me is very, very, very colonial. But it also disconnects the struggle, the Palestinian people's struggles, from gender struggles. So it creates a dichotomy of this is a Palestinian struggle and this is a feminist gender struggle, which for me is very problematic. And then, of course, the Israeli militarization of everything in Palestine, which creates conditions that make Palestinian women and children very, very, very vulnerable to all sorts of abuses, gender-based violence and sexual violence. So that, for me, is very, very problematic. And then finally, it's also about the strategic silence of Israeli officials, by and large, the Zionists, world over, the Christian Zionists. So for me, that confirms that the state is kind of trying to force into Palestinians a way in which gender must be perceived, gender must be practiced, gender must be accepted, which for me is really, really, really problematic. When we come to the Kenyan context, and especially looking at the liberation struggles in Kenya, you find while even our liberation movements were termed as terrorists, just like the liberation struggle in Palestine is, our women who were in the liberation struggle, armed liberation struggle, number one, were first and foremost abused sexually to begin with. But besides that, how they were defined as subhuman or inhuman for being women and being in that space of liberation and struggle. And so they were not elevated, they were not edified for playing that role. And that continues to date, even in our history, which by and large was written by the Western scholars, not our people, who, even when I was going to school those years, we were told that the Mau Mau, which was our liberation army, they were terrorists. And when they, yes, many years after independence, and our women who participated in the liberation struggle to date have never got, we still fight for their recognition because they were dehumanized, they were branded. You know, besides being terrorists, there's the gender branding. There's the negative, toxic feminist branding of these women being, you know, like not being women enough, not being, you know, those confines of what they expect of a feminist. You are not feminine enough. You are arrogant. You are too aggressive. You do not, you know, your body doesn't look like, how dare you hold a gun and such things. So I think there's a lot of correlation between our gender history in the liberation struggle and the gender feminist struggles in Palestine and the liberation of Palestine.
One thing that stood out to me about what you said, Naomi, is about the Western controlled narrative and the fact that it takes away the power of the resistance of women. And I think especially right after October 7th, as the massacres in Gaza were happening, we saw all these narratives about women and children, highlighting their deaths. And the underlying message in that is these, by the international community, not even Israel, because Israel, you know, doesn't value any Palestinian lives, but let's just assume that the international community values Palestinian lives who are currently victims. They say women and children are not involved in any sort of resistance. They are just victims, and they laugh at their, this is so sad, and we must stand up against it. So I think that was something that really stood out to me, and we still see it. We still see the numbers highlighting women and children as they're the only ones whose deaths matter, and also men don't matter. And anybody might be involved in any sort of resistance, it's okay to massacre them. So, Hala, if you want to add anything else.
I don't have much to add. I think Loubna and Naomi covered it very well. I just would say one small thing, that talking about it in the Palestinian context and in the Kenyan context, and just showing how all of this is rooted in the same system that is controlling the world. All of this is rooted in white Western imperialism, which Israel is also has originated from that system, just comes to show how we are against one enemy, B, this opens up a lot of opportunities for us as oppressed peoples to be thinking together in a shared struggle, while also understanding the particularities about each context, but also understanding how there is a global system in the works here, and how Israel is part of this global system, but that this global system is operating and has operated for ages in different parts of the world. That's it.
No, that's a really good point. I think that brings me to my next question, which is, and I know when you talk about this, I think the word is saying obviously that either of you have an answer to this question is, how does colonial feminism contribute to the persistence of global white supremacy? How are they related?
Yeah, I mean, I think, okay, so I think just looking at what's kind of happened the last 3 months is actually a really great example of this, right? So we have seen in the last 100 days, we have seen literally a complete erasure of Palestinian women and feminist narratives. We have seen a complete disposability of any empathy and recognition of the pain and suffering and death of Palestinian men, right? So even in the minimal case, when as you mentioned, when Palestinian women and children are given some partial recognition in the affective world, Palestinian men are still disposable from that. That comes from the long history of how brown, Black, Muslim, colonized men have been considered disposable, right? Outside of modernity, outside of humanity, outside of those who are entitled to rights-bearing citizenship. And so this is kind of an extension of that. We have seen all of this accusations around Palestinian men being violent rapists, baby killers, baby murderers, right? All of these different things in the exact moment when all of those claims have been provided with no substantiated survivor testimony or forensic evidence, and has been promoted by state officials and leaders of NGOs and leaders of organizations that have already no credibility because of their previous lies, right? Because of their previous manufacturing of false news in order to justify the genocide. So we're seeing those stories take precedent in every institution, from the president of this country, the United States, to UN Women, to all of these liberal institutions make declarations condemning the sexual violence, alleged sexual violence that took place on October 7th. Meanwhile, we are actively witnessing Palestinian men being stripped to their underwear. We are seeing photographs and video footage of maiming and torture, sexual and gender torture on Palestinian bodies. And we are hearing testimonies, as Hala mentioned earlier, of Palestinian prisoners coming out talking about the deep, deep psychological, physical, and sexual torture that prisoners are experiencing. So this kind of creates a gaslighting paradox, right? Where we are being told that the humanity, that the pain, that the suffering of our colonizers is something that we must drop everything to recognize, while at the same time, Palestinians are completely rendered outside of sympathy, care, concern can be extended. So I think that this is an example of what we mean by how colonial feminism is contributing to global white supremacy. It recalibrates the racial order of the world, where certain life is worthy, where certain pain and suffering is legible and recognizable, and where certain people and certain communities and religions and races reside outside of that kind of love and care and respect, right? It reside outside of that kind of recognition, where there, even when Palestinian activists or the Palestinian resistance in Gaza forces the world to actually see what is happening in the current moment, we start to see all of these pivots for, deflections, denial, excuses, or justifications, or minimization of the actual horror and catastrophe of the genocide that we're witnessing unfold in Gaza. So I think that this is what we mean by how it recalibrates the white supremacy global world order, right? Because it keeps a certain racial hierarchy, and it keeps a racial hierarchy that is not just about color or not just about certain groups over others, but that is also preserving the imperialist agenda of empire's forces, as Hala had mentioned earlier.
Totally agree with that. And just to add a small bit on that, I think that the propagation of the propagation of the superiority of imperialist Israel and US underrates the Palestinians' way of life, culture, art, power, and everything, leading to justification of maiming, torture, ill and degrading treatments. No wonder when we are told on international media that they are human animals, we don't question that. We don't even, I expected outrage. We don't see that kind of outrage because the superiority narrative of these imperialist powers has been so deep entrenched in people to the extent that people start believing, in any case, these people are not human. So torture is okay for them. Maiming is okay for them. Whatever other treatment is okay for them, including mass killing. And we even start debating, is it genocide or not? Because we have lowered their humanness, their human beingness to something else. I used to, a while ago, after October 7th began, I would curse and say, Israel is an animal state. And my baby, who is 9 years old, stopped me from using that term. He said, Mom, I feel so offended every time you call Israel animals. Because we have this dog that adopted, we have this cat that adopted children, two cats. One adopted children of kittens of a cat who we didn't know because we found the one kitten thrown by someone, and my son brought them home. And this cat adopted four of them. She fed them to death. She finally died because I think they over breastfed her calcium. She died out of that. And then we have this other one who is alive, adopted her cousin's kids who abandoned them at day 10. And then we have this dog that always speaks. I mean, yes, I love animals. So we have this dog that every time the puppies of this other dog fell in the drain, she would go and pick them and bring them into the kennel and really cuddle them and, wipe them off the mud or water. And so every time I called Israel animal, my 9-year-old would be like, Mom, I think it's so offensive. Look at what our animals do. Israel is not, they're not even animals, there's something else. And he told me to find a name for Israel, which I said beast. And he was like, maybe that one. Yeah, so I am learning not to call them animals anymore. But I wanted to say that if you go to a state where daily raping and defilement of Palestinian women and children by soldiers goes unquestioned, they prevent women from giving birth by controlling their sexual health reproductive rights. They kill mothers and kill babies, denying mothers the right to be mothers. They use rape as a weapon of war. They bomb pregnant women, and those that are not bombed are sent into premature birth, where CS is done without anesthesia, where we have 180 women giving birth daily, 48 mothers every hour, under no services on sexual health reproductive rights, then I think there's a problem with that civilization, even if they proclaim gender consciousness. There's a problem because at the core of our feminism, femininity is reproduction, is reproductive, is creating life, is bringing forth life. And if that is undermined, then I think it is very wrong for whoever to ever think that they are feminist or they are gender conscious or they're pro-feminism. And to the extent that they want to control narratives to show that it is the other side that kills babies, it is the other side that is raping children and women, then I think there's a problem there. Like my son, I would say, let's look for another terminology and not feminism, because it is not. In fact, even imperial feminist is not even a good terminology because there is no feminism there. backward or not, there's no feminism there. It is dictatorship, it's imperialism, it's control, but also it is colonialism. And I don't know if colonialism, and just looking at the principles of feminism, for example, a few core principles of challenging and distributive power, looking at well-being and nonviolence, looking at respect for each other and others, deep democracy and intersectionality, dismantling bias, responsible and transparent use of power, accountability, courage to challenge powers that be, opposing oppression, and resilience and radical solidarity. If those principles are anything to go by in feminism, then there's nothing like even imperial feminism in what we are saying in Israel and US. I would like to just say that.
Loubna and Hala, can you maybe just give us a brief background on how Israel tries to brand itself as a feminist, Western, liberal, free nation, whereas the Palestinians and Western women, they stone gay people, and Israel is the only one with possibilities. There's no one formally as watching, but I think it's of should go in the class say that. And because obviously this narrative didn't start on October 7th. None of this started on October 7th. This is a $1 billion campaign that Israel has done since its existence.
Me, Loubna, do you want to start? Should I start?
Go ahead, Hala.
Sorry. Well, as I'm going to start with where you finished, Lina, that basically this is not new. Since its inception, Israel has relied on Orientalist, racist, and Islamophobic tropes about Palestinians and Arabs generally. And we can see it stretching to even before 1948, where the Zionists claimed that we cannot cultivate our land, even though we are a society majority of farmers, and that's what we knew what to do. But we weren't developed enough to cultivate our lands. And from that, stretching to saying that the Palestinian society is violent in its culture, it has a violent culture, and Israel, it's not only against Palestinians. Israel has called itself the villa in the jungle, referring to all of the Arab nations in the Middle East, and women. Palestinian women, Arab women, and queer people, for that matter, throughout the years, have been used as, let's say, a pawn to show that Israel is progressive amongst the primitive, and it's the same logic that now mobilizes global right-wing movements in the world when they talk about immigrants, when they talk about Black peoples, when they talk about Muslims that are a threat to women or a threat to Western values. And if we're going to talk about what is happening now specifically, we have seen how Netanyahu has called Palestinians the children of darkness, and that this is a war between the children of light and the children of darkness. And this kind of propaganda, but one that is like, it's a deep-rooted ideology. It's not something that Israel only uses. It's a deep-rooted ideology and practice, serves two main objectives and two main purposes. First, to whitewash Israel's image, and second, to dehumanize the other. And in this case, the other is the Palestinians. And this works. It works because Israel has its servants. Israel has mainstream media. Israel has other world leaders which are said, they're already racist. They're already hating to Arabs. They're already classist in nature. So it's not like it's that Israel is convincing anyone new. It is talking to the people that are racist in their nature. And these are the same institutions that have been promoting Israeli propaganda since October 7th specifically, but has been doing that for years. And Israel has promoted itself as a safe haven for women, for queer people, and this has been used to pinkwash its crimes throughout the year. It has been used to attract tourists. It has been used to attract all kinds of artists and people, because it's an industry. We should also remember that it's an industry. It's a profit-making machine as well for the Zionists. So it has been working on this and showing that it's accepting of Palestinian queers, and that Palestinian queer people are having to run away from their families, from their primitive families, and come and find shelter within the Israelis and so on. So these things, I mean, there are Palestinian queer movements and a Palestinian feminist movement that have been working for years to show how A, this is not true, and B, even if it was true, which is not, but even if it was true, this does not make Israel any better. This does not change the fact that Israel is a settler, colonial, murderous entity that must be dismantled. Yeah, I think I've spoken too much. I'll give the mic to Loubna.
It was amazing, Hala. And yeah, I mean, I think one thing I'll just add on is, as I was hearing you speak, Hala, I'm thinking about how the way in which colonial feminism is deployed, weaponization, pinkwashing, weaponization of the language of queer rights, it also kind of parallels some other really essential characteristics of Zionism and of the Israeli state. And I think that for me, I've been thinking a lot about Zionism and Israel's contradictions and how, on the one hand, they appear to kind of stagger over one another, right? They all seem to just all their talking points seem to contradict itself. And on the other hand, thinking about how some of those contradictions can be very generative for Israel, right? So, one thing that I see persistently when it comes to many issues is that there is an Israeli obsession with not just, and this is about settler colonialism, not just erasing Palestinians, but taking our place. So that means the appropriation of our culture, of our history, of our food, of our language, the appropriation, the actual physical taking of our place in our historic homeland. And that kind of like taking our place manifest in the way in which Zionists imitate the same phrases that we say, the same arguments that we make about our struggle. We started calling what's happening in Gaza a genocide. They said that they endured a genocide on October 7th. We're talking about the sexual and gendered violence our prisoners are facing. Then they doubled down on the false rape allegations of October 7th. We're talking about mothers and the reproductive violence that they're enduring, giving birth to babies in these conditions, these horrific conditions. And then they double talking about the slogan of believe women except if they're Israeli, right? So we constantly see this historic narrative of the Israelis trying to erase Palestinians and take our place in the land. When we started talking about Palestinians being indigenous to the land, they started talking about Israelis being indigenous to the land. When we talk about the Palestinian refugee right of return, they talk about them making their settlement, their settler colonial settlement in our land being a refugee right of return, right? So every time in history we saw this imitation of Israelis literally trying to be us, we are seeing this in this moment, and that doesn't stop at the way colonial feminism or Zionist feminism is being weaponized. The second thing that I would say is that there's something really important and generative about the contradiction that Israel relies on about being both those in control and in power, and trying to promote the image that the state is unbreakable, that it's invincible, that it can never be, that colonial occupation can never be overthrown, but also persistently playing the victim card, right? And I think that this is part of the way in which every time we want to talk about the home demolitions, the land annexation, the siege on Gaza, the wars, the human rights violations, what we hear back is the reverberation that we hear back is any accusation, any criticism of the state of Israel or of Zionism, or any questioning of Zionism as a concept is anti-Semitism by default. And I think that this contradiction about both wanting to be the invincible power and also wanting to be the perpetual victim is something that is a contradiction that we also see play out in colonial feminism. So that in the end, we have 30,000 Palestinians who have been massacred in 100 days. We have the largest number of children who have been massacred than all of the modern world's conflicts combined in the last few years. And yet we're still talking about the Israeli civilians that were killed, or the Israelis, I don't even want to say civilians, that were killed on October 7th. And we don't even have an actual number, right? They started with 1,400, dropped to 1,200. Some reports are saying as low as 600. And many reports are saying very, very few of them were civilians and most of them were military. So we are in this constant cycle of being gaslit and the paradox of trying to make sense of reality when it's very difficult to make sense, because they persistently present these contradictions in order to confuse us, in order to distract us, in order to deflect from the material reality of who holds power and how they are deploying it, and the fact that their power is really being questioned right now, both by the world's movements and by Palestinian resistance on the ground.
We know that sexual violence exists. It's a thing that women are often not believed when they accuse people of sexual violence. And at the same time, we know that power dynamics exist and that allegations of sexual violence do not exist independent of those power dynamics. I think in the U.S. context, the example that comes to mind most obviously is Emmett Till, the 14-year-old black boy who was lynched because a white woman accused him of some sexually inappropriate behavior. She later in her 90s admitted that it was a lie, and obviously nothing happened to her. We know the example of the 5 black and brown boys who are known as the Central Park Five, who, based on a very similar media campaign led by, for example, Donald Trump, about the behavior of these quote-unquote wild black boys, that they raped and murdered a white woman at Central Park, only to be later exonerated after spending years in prison. So how do I first of all, with the knowledge of all of those things, how do we balance our commitment to anti-colonial feminism, to anti-racism, with the idea that we should, quote unquote, believe women? Should we always believe women? As many feminists, white feminists would say, as some people commented on the Instagram posts of this event, saying, I always believe women. I don't care what their nationality is. I don't care what color they are. How would you respond to that?
Hala, do you want to go first, or? Okay, I think that this is like a challenging question, and I'm sure it's something that we're all really been thinking very intentionally about. I think, pertaining to the recent allegations, I think that there's something different between, believe women is a euphemism for believe survivors, believe survivor testimony. We don't have survivor testimony. The testimony we have are from actors who are the same actors who said that there were 40 beheaded babies, who are the same actors that said that they personally eyewitness saw a baby burnt in an oven, which, by the way, was an actual story that happened to a Palestinian child during the 1948 Nakba in Deir Yassin, right? So I think that it's very important. Naomi said this earlier. Feminism is not about women and men and children. Feminism is about power. It's about an analysis of how we see power in the world. It's an analysis of how we see ideologies and structures of power. So I would never refute that an instance of sexual violence happened in any context, whether that be within white communities here in the United States or within Israeli communities or within Palestinian communities, right? But as a feminist, it is my responsibility to have a critical appraisal of how sexual and gendered violence, most often than not, is constructed by structural power, right? It's legitimized by the state. It's legitimized by the military. It becomes a part of social dynamics within our community because it is permitted in the toxic masculinist patriarchal structure of the world that we live in, right? And so I think that this for me is the importance of, like, when we talk about whether or not it did or didn't happen, or how we understand this, I think it's important to understand who holds the power to actually implement sexual and gendered violence on a systemic level, not on an interpersonal level, right? On a systemic level, and then to actually take the conversation from there. And I mean, this is a bit broad, but I think that this is maybe the difference between liberal colonial feminists who deal with, you know, the question of feminism in a very individualistic and very interpersonal way, versus women of color, third world, Black, Indigenous feminists who have always understood the intersections between patriarchy, homophobia, militarism, class warfare, imperialism, and the violence of the state, right? And understanding how those things not just work together, but feed one another. If we lived in transformative societies, if we lived in societies that didn't have authoritarian regimes or military apparatuses or violent police forces or violent prison and carceral structures, we probably would live in much healthier societies when it came to the question of safety and protection from sexual violence in our families and in our homes. There would be actually a priority by the states that we live in, or the societies that we live in, to hold accountable perpetrators, and to hold them accountable in a way that actually socially transforms the society, as opposed to just locking people up and hoping that the problem goes away.
I mean, I completely agree with everything that Loubna said. But I mean, as you said, Lina, we are here talking to you as feminists and as people who have been part of years of struggle around issues of sexual violence. But our struggle comes from a wider view of power dynamics and a wider view on justice. And this is why also for us, Palestine is a feminist issue, because it's an issue of justice, first and foremost. And this is why it's important to understand the context within which all of this is happening. I won't add or repeat what Loubna was saying. I would just say that when it comes to Palestinians, especially as they're facing genocide, accusations such as these cannot be taken lightly. And these claims of rape started to rise since the first moments of the October 7th happened. They came along with the claims of beheading babies and other absurd claims. And no one bothered to check. No one bothered to know whether this is true or not. Everyone adopted this narrative without questioning. Again, as I said before, because this world is already Islamophobic and racist, you don't have to spend much time, convincing anyone. And this is not about supporting rape and believe, like, this is absurd. It's about being responsible when you know that these accusations are coming from a genocidal entity that is spending millions in its propaganda machine. And when it's accusing an entire population, one that is facing a genocide. So far, no first-hand or even second-hand testimonies were given of survivals. Some of those investigating the cases of the so-called rape are figures that have close ties to the Israeli government. One recent example, Israelis that were supposedly quoted in the New York Times investigations themselves came out after and said that these claims were not true, and so on. Yet everyone, again, adopted these claims without questioning. And it's also important to remember that Israel started in talking about it as individual cases, but then to take it a step further, it started claiming that it was a systematic policy of Hamas to conduct mass rapes. A gigantic claim, a very, very, very big claim, with zero evidence whatsoever. Again, everyone rushed to adopt this because, well, Palestinian resistance is already demonized, and Palestinian men are already demonized, and Palestinian men are already dehumanized. So it was just fueling something that was already being put forward in the media. And I would end by saying that we, as women and as feminists, we know how brutal it is to use rape as a tool of war and as a tool in wars. And we know that this has caused suffering to tens of thousands of women around the world. And this is why when it's used by Israel in this manner, it's dangerous, and it stifles the just struggles against rape and against the use of rape in wars and so on.
What imperialism is succeeding to do is to create the us versus them situation. Because when you look at, for example, the genocide, the genocide convention, the Geneva Genocide Convention is very clear on sexual violence as a weapon of war. And where it is evident, it is very clear. I mean, the convention clearly outlines what exactly it is. And it states that as either war, a crime against humanity or war crimes, and calls upon the states in power to investigate and punish the perpetrators. It even goes ahead to classify. There are three classifications of three overarching classification of sexual violence in conflict. One is war tactic, sexual violence used as a war tactic, where intentionality is very clear. The second one is tolerated, not necessarily ordered by state officials, but they tolerate it. And the third one is where it is committed by independent individuals. Either way, the state has the obligation to ensure that, number one, there are very, very clear investigations that either confirm the violence or unconfirmed. And to both situations, the state has the obligation to punish whoever uses lies to malign others, or whoever uses sexual violence, perpetration of sexual violence against others. We are not saying this by any of these states that are supporting the genocide. The other thing that the convention has done is to clearly state that use of sexual violence can be termed as a genocide. We are not seeing that happening. But my disappointment so much in this, and I avoid talking about October 7th, because the use of sexual violence has happened since time immemorial, ever since Israel came into being. But there is a lot of emphasis on October 7th, which is not so documented, which is intentional. There is no proper documentation, so that we are not able to hold Israel accountable. So it's very intentional, it's deliberate. Yet when you go to West Bank, where the genocide is not happening, even though the occupation, the colonization is happening, and they are really, really committing atrocities, there's quite a bit of documented sexual violence, incidences of sexual violence, most of which are documented to have been perpetrated by the Israeli army or the colonial settlers. Nothing is happening. So I try to avoid talking about October 7th because there's no proper documentation. Yet there's proper documentation in West Bank, and they are not talking about that. So I think it's important to situate sexual violence in Israel within the Geneva Convention, Genocide Convention. I also wanted to just say that the weaponization of narratives, accountability, and resources has become so powerful that, for example, I've been trying to mobilize the Kenyan gender feminist movement into supporting the Israeli question. At best, they say the situation is very bad, but they do not, like, the way we can be visual, nothing like that. For two reasons. Number one, the narrative is so strong that I don't seem to be credible compared to what CNN, BBC, and others have portrayed out there. But number two, we are receiving funding from organizations that are Israeli-based or American-based. And so if we challenge this, what happens to our funding? So I think there's a lot of militarization of narratives and also resources, but also accountability. And we are so afraid. We have been seeing it in all the resolutions that have been coming up at the UN. We are seeing how afraid people are, African nations and other nations are towards the South African position of taking Israel to the ICJ. So I think accountability has also been weaponized. And I think we need to, I don't know what, but we need to, we are brainwashed and we need to do something about that. And then, of course, I talked a bit about compartmentalization of struggles. So we start looking at the gender feminist struggles as the struggles of Palestinian women and queer women, and that's it. And that we can support. But when it comes to colonization and colonization and occupation, then it's not a struggle we women and feminists can be part of, and even the Israeli and the Palestinian women who talk about queer women and gender issues, then those are good people. The us versus them, those are good people. But these are the ones who talk about throwing stones, civilized. But those who throw stones, those who support Hamas to fight, those who, those are inhuman, they are human animals. And then, of course, the whole militarization of water, food, work, and reproduction. I'm very worried because, for example, if you starve people, if there's no food, if people cannot work productively, if women cannot give birth, then we are starving the battalion, number one. But number two, we are putting the burden of struggle for food, struggle for water, because this is a gender role. It's women who perform that. So if we keep women busy looking for water, keep women busy looking for relief food, because then if their children have survived the bomb, they are going to die of famine. So they keep me busy away from the battlefield where I'm supposed to be fighting for liberation, to stay busy with looking for food, relief food, looking for water, looking for, those very inhuman jobs, and then struggling to give back because lest we get this extinct, because they're bombing so many children, 10, 15 every minute. we will finish our population. So women should give birth. But how do we give birth? Then we have, so I think this whole thing, while they think about civilized feminism, but at the same time, they are shooting themselves on the foot, because feminism is also at the core of renewal. We are not renewing life. We are not renewing health. We are not renewing joy. So I think there's a problem there, and I doubt if that is healthy feminism.
I think the last question that I'll open up for Q&A for the many people here. You guys hear me? Is, at this point, can we say for sure whether there were any acts of sexual violence committed on October 7th? And does it matter? And why, when?
You know, the reason why it's a difficult question to talk about is because the equivalent is like, can we talk about something that isn't rooted in something? Like, I mean, let's bring survivor testimony about what happened October 7th, and then we can have the conversation. Bring forensic evidence about what happened October 7th and get the state to stop blocking, right? To stop blocking that kind of forensic investigation. And let's talk about what happened. Hamas themselves welcomed a partial international investigation about the rape allegations on October 7th. So when that becomes a topic that we should be discussing, when there is something to discuss there, I think we are all open to discuss it, because at the core we are feminists, right? But I think the question about whether it matters, the reason why it's being deployed in the way that it is, the reason why it's getting the attention in the way that it is, whether it's from the New York Times or UN Women, whether it's from philanthropic organizations who are issuing statements when they've never issued one statement about massacres and mass rape and all these things, not just amongst Palestinians, but amongst most parts of the third world, right? The reason why it's being privileged right now is because it is purposefully being deployed as a tool of propaganda. When Naomi talked earlier about how rape is used as a weapon of war in the Genocide Convention or in crimes against humanity, the Israeli state is very conscious about the language that they're using all the way through. They know that they are going to be facing the international actors in the International Court of Justice and in the ICC. They know that. I mean, even I was thinking yesterday, even the phrasing of Hamas-Israel war, it's not just Hamas who's fighting in the Gaza Strip, right? It's other Palestinian forces as well. But so long as they use the word Hamas, they can say Hamas is a political group and political groups are exempt from the crime of genocide, right? They are very calculated about the language they're using to try to protect themselves legally, to try to protect their position in public opinion. And so I think that these accusations or these allegations of October 7th and the language that they've been using and the campaigns, I mean, they were preparing to reignite, by the way, to reignite the mass rape allegations campaign to be relaunched on November 25th, which was International Day of the Elimination of Violence Against Women, because they knew that on that day, people would be having a conversation about the pregnant Palestinian mothers who are having emergency C-sections without anesthesia in the Gaza Strip. So in order to get ahead of a narrative that would really put some questions around Zionism and the state of Israel in the view of international law and public perception and international aid, they wanted to launch that campaign. And so much of the Zionist feminist campaign work that's been happening is funded by the state, is organized by the PR arms of the state. And I think that these are the reasons that for us as feminists, especially Palestinian feminists, women of color feminists, third world feminists who are watching an active genocide, who are watching our people being slaughtered in the Gaza Strip, this is not our concern until they bring us a legitimate conversation to have. Until then, we have paid it way too much attention. And we know that it is a mechanism of denial and deflection that all colonial forces have used in history.
Yeah, I mean, this question kind of reminds me of how there is something that the Zionists, but not only the Zionists, a lot of people in the world are trying to divert you from the main material reality by talking about imagined scenarios. Like, there are imagined scenarios in their mind, and let's get everyone to talk about the imagined scenarios. Like the same way as liberal Zionists always keep saying, what will happen to the Jewish people if Zionism is dismantled? What these imagined scenarios that gain more and more importance and significance than the actual material reality on the ground. As Loubna said, bring me an actual case and then we can talk about it, and then we could think as Palestinians, how do we deal with it? But don't preoccupy me with imagined scenarios. And I think one of these things that these claims, one of the roles that these claims play, not only in the world, but let's say amongst us Palestinians and Palestinian feminists, that it's also a method, to make us suspicious of the Palestinian resistance and of our own society, and to distract us from the real issue and put us in a place where we either defend or condemn or question or spend hours discussing or whatever, when actually there is nothing to discuss. But Israel is not one who decides our path, and certainly not the one to be our moral compass on these issues. We are guided by our own anti-colonial, anti-patriarchal, anti-capitalist beliefs and morals. It's not Israel and its imagined scenarios and what it's trying to inflict on the world that decides what is going to preoccupy us now.
Thank you both. I think I would even say, just going back to Loubna, what you said, and Naomi, what you said about feminism. Can you guys hear me? Okay, about feminism being about power. Even if there were survivor testimony, I think the fact of the matter is it doesn't take away from the power dynamic at play. It doesn't take away from the fact that interpersonal acts of violence are different than structural, systematic acts of violence. Interpersonal acts of violence are different than a genocide that's carried out by a state that is trying to wipe out an entire population, including women. And what you just said about the occupation trying to make us suspicious of our own society, of our own resistance. When I was in the West Bank recently, there was a conversation organized by young people, mostly women who had been detained by Israel in the past. It was a public forum in an open space in Ramallah, and they were talking about their experiences of being detained and what would happen to them. Because at that point, any young person who was at a protest, who was posting anything, was very, very aware of the fact that they could be detained at any moment. And so it was preparing everybody for the situation, what might happen. And what every single person said was, they're going to try to find out their secret, whether it's a stupid thing like, whatever, anything. You're dating somebody and your family doesn't know, or you're queer, or whatever it is. And they're going to try to, they might even Photoshop things, right? And they're going to try to say, well, if you don't admit to us that you're doing X, Y, Z, we're going to show this to your brothers and your dad. And they're going to kill you, and and the society won't accept you. And all of these things. And this is the fact that every single woman said that they use the same exact tactics against them. That is what they do. And one of the things that Israel has been doing, one of the deeply disturbing things, is dropping leaflets in Gaza. And they say to the Palestinians, expose the baby killers and the rapists and Hamas, and they're trying to make Palestinian people who are undergoing genocide in every possible way, doubt their own people and support the occupation against themselves, which obviously is a huge stretch, but they really try to get into the psychology of people. And it's so much easier to do this when they're able to just arrest people in the middle of the night, hold them in solitary confinement for weeks, no access to a lawyer, no access to family, children, this is children included, but it really is all part of a campaign to perpetuate this idea that Palestinians are savages, that we are a backward society, that of course we rape women, because of course we rape women and we play with their breasts because we're radical Muslims and we don't care about women, and the whole world will believe that. Joe Biden, on the 100th day of the genocide, released a statement talking exclusively about the Israeli hostages and the Israeli women who were allegedly raped. Said nothing about the thousands of Palestinian women who have been killed, about the hundreds of Palestinian women who are forced to give birth, C-section without anesthesia, newborns who are killed. Nothing, right? Because they just run with these lies that, like Hala said, just reinforce the beliefs that they already have about people in the global south, about Muslims, about brown and black people. So it's so easy for them to run with those ideas. Yeah.
I just wanted to say that divide and rule has always been a tool used by oppressors. In Kenya, we had very strong divide and rule incidents where we had collaborators and the freedom fighters and people who supported the freedom fighters. And unfortunately, there's always a lot of power in the media, religion, and even morality. So they will use that a lot of times to try and dehumanize the resistance side of the community. And of course, they will also have a few carrots to dangle for people who are willing to collaborate. So divide and rule is really, really, really a very, very deliberate approach used by all oppressors all over the world. So this is something that Palestinian comrades must be aware of. And so even when they drop the leaflets, when they do what, they must know that this is an attempt to divide them. And divide and rule doesn't start in the war. It is usually a tool that is used later in the war, because then they realize the resistance is unbreakable. So there are bombs, there's starvation, there's everything else, there's rape and everything else, but still the resistance is not being broken. So then they decide to use their own people to kind of divide and weaken the resistance. And this is something that we must defend at all costs, including using radical solidarity. And that's why for me, it's very important that South Africa is the one and not any other country in the Middle East that went to the ICJ, because for me, radical solidarity means that it shouldn't necessarily be based on my race, should be based on my gender or age. It should just be based on my history of oppression and experience. And so that is why it's very good. And that is why I would like to invite all of us to celebrate each and every country that is supporting the South African case publicly. Support it publicly. Go on media, social media, go to mainstream media. Talk about Namibia that is calling Germany out. Talk about South Africa that is now building an arsenal of over 50 lawyers to go to court again. Talk about, let's call out those countries like Kenya that are not supporting South Africa, because the South African case is an African case, is a humanity case. That's all I would say. And people who have no humanity will always use every other tool, tactics and approaches, including divide and rule. So we must speak out. Thank you. And I wanted to also say, and Hala used the word compass. I had written, and I wanted to really say that even as we discuss this whole issue of feminism, let's not also forget intersectionalities and how the intersectionalities affect these struggles, including the struggles in Palestine. Let's not just look at Palestinian women or Palestinian men, Palestinian children from the way they've been presented to us. Let's look at all the layers of discrimination, marginalization, and everything when analyzing the Palestinian question. And I wanted to conclude by saying Israel and America are not feminism compass. So they must not tell us how to practice feminism. I think as a people, and now more proud of being an African than ever before, we are so clear on what feminism is. And if they want a script, or if they want a textbook, they should come to Africa. So is it okay that we open the forum up for a Q&A, or you'd like to add something?
Is it questions? Well, yes. Thank you.
I think just in the context of where we are and making it make sense, like what does Zionism have to do with Pan-Africanism? I think it's important to bring up the Uganda scheme and to talk about how Zionists claim that, the promised land is Palestine, but they were looking at other countries and other places to build Israel, which means there's no connection to land. There's no indigeneity. It's colonization. But I think in the context of Africa, we need to talk about the Uganda scheme and how the Zionists almost built Israel right here in East Africa. Leave
Hi everyone, my name is Irene. Also, what to add on what has Zionism got to do with Pan-Africanism? It's not just about the history. It's also about the fact that it has a lot to do with Pan-Africanism already. Because if we study what's happening in Congo and what's happening in Sudan, what's happening in Sahrawi, what's happening in Ethiopia, Eritrea right now, it has a lot to do with it. And as Kenyans, I know it's very embarrassing to be Kenyan in such situation. If you think about the role that Kenya as a colonial and imperial project plays in spreading Zionism and unprovocably just, invading other countries and going in as proxies. You're seeing how Kenya is now aggressing every neighbor in the region for no reason. So it has a lot to do with it. And that's why it's very important to connect these struggles. There are still talks of those people coming to Africa, and they are looking at Congo. It's still, they're still the same people, the tear gas that they use to, throw on the streets when we go to protest. They're the ones who produce them. So it has a lot to do with us already. It's not just about what they might have done. It's also about what they're already doing. And of course, as an ecologist, I cannot sit down without speaking about the ecological crimes that they do. You're all aware about the food question. They are very at the center of it. The GM question and putting industrial farms and sending away people, like evicting people from their land to set up industrial farms for their GM food. They are very at the center of it. So if we talk about land, they are there. If we talk about our water, they are right there. If we talk about our air, they are there. They are literally everywhere, suffocating people. So the Palestinian struggle, it is our struggle. It is the struggle of the Congo. It is the struggle of the Sudan. It is the struggle of the Sahrawi. It is the struggle of Eritreans, Djibouti right now. And for Kenyans in the room, it is both an internal and external struggle, because we literally have a Zionist regime, an openly Zionist regime. And it is so embarrassing for a country that has a history of settler colonialism and that is still a settler colonial project with millions of acres still under settler colonialism, being openly Zionist. It is so embarrassing that sometimes when I go into spaces with other African people, I just say I am from East Africa. Because it hurts so much to say that you are from Kenya, because even personally, I don't identify with this thing called Kenya, this entity called Kenya. It does not make sense to me. When we sing the national anthem, bless our land and nation, whose land are we talking about? Justice is whose shield and defender, you know? So we have a lot of work. It is both a very internal and external struggle for us as Kenyans. Because if they decide to come to Kenya, you can be very sure Zakayo is going to welcome them with open arms. He's not even going to question. So it is literally a struggle for survival for us as Kenyans as well.
Hi, my name is Sepo. Thank you so much. The conversation was very enriching. To sit down and to be able to hear conversations on colonial feminism and also on the issue of Palestine that is ongoing, and of course on the violence that has been meted. And maybe not a question, but just a few comments from the panelists who have spoken. And I just to talk about something that Naomi was talking about earlier. When we talk about feminism, is that feminism cannot be associated with backwardness or retrogression. So we cannot put feminism in the same conversation. For example, when we say colonialism and feminism, it's very contradictory. It's like saying liberative struggles or liberative colonization. It's not possible for anybody who's colonizing you to do it in a progressive manner. It is not possible for anybody who is oppressing you to do it in a progressive manner. So feminism, as is said, is something that is already progressive. So it cannot be associated with anything that is backward. And maybe as Naomi was talking about the story of animals, we should find a different name for those people who are retrogressive, for those people who are backward, and for the violence that is being meted. That is not feminism, and I don't know what that name is, but maybe we can come up with it together. The second thing I want to say, and especially on this issue of Palestine, which we have seen across the globe, is that you and me are Palestine, and I think Irene has talked about it. When we are talking about this conversation or when we are fighting, we are not just fighting for Palestine, we are fighting for ourselves, because now it is a global system of imperialism that is going against Palestine. And tomorrow they will go against Russia. And the other day they will come against Congo. And the other day they will go against you. And if you do not stand up to speak against Palestine, and as we say, nobody will be able to stand up to speak for you, because you're going to call for people and nobody will be there. So it is our responsibility to speak out against this global system of imperialism that is across the globe. And also, since imperialism is an international system, of course, we need to be internationalists for us to be able to fight against it. And I'm so happy that we have a good representation of that internationalism here, fighting against this global system. And lastly, even as we're here today on the Palestinian question, we also have a Pan-African Socialist Alliance here that is a conglomeration of progressive and revolutionary organizations, with the Kenyan Palestine being one of them. And we are also realizing an event on Haiti, which will be on the 24th of January. We'll be speaking against all the injustices and violence that has been meted on Haiti. And in the same manner that we're speaking about Palestine, in the same manner that we speak about Western Sahara, we'll also be raising our voices against what is going on in Haiti. Irene was talking about Kenya, and it's like Kenya is at the middle of everything. And now, even with the Haiti issue, it's Kenya. It's Kenya who is taking their troops down to Haiti. And of course, it's very shameful. I'm not ashamed to be Kenyan in my own life. I just go ahead and say, fine, I'm Kenyan, but there is the president and there's this system, but there are also revolutionary people who are on the ground and who are working every day to go against these social evils. In the same manner, we have people in the United States who are not pro-Biden and who are always fighting against these evils. And I think those are the people that we should be hailing and the stories we should be telling. So on the 24th of January, which is a Wednesday like this next week, we will be at the Kenya National Theatre from 3 p.m. And all of you are invited, and probably will be able to share the flyer and you can circulate it, or you can join us to be able to hail this cause.
From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. Forward to the Palestinian struggle forward.